Hello, all you fine folks, and welcome to ASMR Storytime. So, I just want to take a moment and talk to you just a few moments about what I'm going to do in the next few videos. What my plans are so that we can get through this book is to, instead of doing the unboxing that I've been doing in the beginning of the videos, I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into reading. I'd like to get this book finished in the next few days. I do have some different ASMR techniques that I'm wanting to try with you guys. And I'll have some stuff coming in within the next few days. But I really would like to try to get through this book before we start some of the other ASMR. So that being said, I hope you guys will consider liking and subscribing, and I'm gonna go ahead and get right on into it. Chapter 3. My father arranged his family, his flocks, and all of his household for the journey. Jacob led, holding a great olive staff in his hand, flanked by Levi and Simon, who strutted with importance. Behind them walked the women and children too young to be tending the herds. So Uznah's little son and daughter stayed near their mother's legs, and Zibatu carried her baby girl in a hip sling. I started out near Zilba, hoping to lighten the sadness that clung to her, but her sorrow finally chased me to my mother and Bila, who were engrossed in planning meals and paid no attention to me. So I found my way to Rachel, whose smile did not fade even as the sun began to beat down on us in earnest. The bundle on her back was more than large enough for the terrapin, and I was sure that that was there where they were hidden. Joseph, Tali, and Isa were told to stay with the pack animals near the women, which made them sulk and kick at the dirt and mutter about how they were old enough to be trusted with more important work than tending a tame donkey and the ox who drew the heavy cart. Directly behind us and the beast of burden, Reuben had charge of the herd and the shepherds, who included Zebulun and Dan, Gad and Asher, and the bondsman Nomir, husband of Zibatu, and Zimri, father of Uzna's children. The 4 dogs ran around the perimeter of the flocks, their ears flattened to their heads as they worked. They lifted their brown eyes from the goats and sheep only when Jacob approached and bounded to the master's side to bask for a moment in the touch of his hand and the sound of his voice. Judah, our rear guard, walked behind the herds, watching out for stragglers. I would have been lonely there with no one to talk to, but my brother seemed to enjoy his solitude. I was in awe of the numbers of what seemed our great wealth. Joseph told me that we were a small party by any measure, with only 2 pack animals to carry our belongings, but I remained proud of my father's holdings, and I thought my mother carried herself like a queen. We had walked for only a little while when Levi pointed out a figure ahead, sitting by the side of the path. As we came closer, Rachel shouted, "Ina," and ran ahead to greet her friend and teacher. The midwife was arrayed for travel, a donkey laden with blankets and baskets by her side. The caravan did not stop at the unexpected sight of the lone woman. It would have been pointless to bring the herd to a halt in the absence of water. Instead, Ina approached Jacob, leading her donkey and falling in step behind him. Ina did not address my father, but spoke to Rachel so that he would overhear her words. The midwife presented her case with fancy phrases that sounded odd, coming from the mouth that usually spoke in the plainest and sometimes the coarsest of terms. "Oh, my friend," she said, "I cannot bear to see you part. My life would be desolate in your absence, and I am too old to take another apprentice. I wish only to join with your family and be among you for the rest of my days. I would give your husband all of my possessions in exchange for his protection and a place among the women of his tents. I would accompany you as your bondswoman or as your maidservant to practice my craft in the south and learn what they have to teach there. I would minister to your family, setting the pricks for your women, healing the wounds of your men, offering service to Gula the healer in Jacob's name," Ina said. She flattered my father, whom she called wise as well as kind. She declared herself his servant. I was one of many witnesses to Ina's speech. Levi and Simon stayed close, curious to learn what the midwife wanted. Leah and Bila had quickened their pace to discover why their friend had appeared among them. Even Zilpah roused herself and drew near. Rachel turned her face to Jacob, her eyebrows posing the question, her hands clasped to her chest. Her husband smiled into her face. "Your friend is welcome. She will be your maidservant in my eyes. She is yours as though she were part of your dowry. There is nothing more to say." Rachel kissed Jacob's hand and placed it for a moment upon her heart. Then she led Ina and her donkey back to our animals where the women could talk more freely. "Sister," Rachel said to the midwife, "what is this about?" Ina dropped her voice and began by telling a story, a sorry tale about a deformed stillbirth, a tiny head, twisted limbs, born to a girl made pregnant at her first blood. "Too young," said Ina, with an angry mouth. "Far too young. The father was a stranger, a wild-haired man of many years, who wore only a loincloth and brought his wife to Ina's hut. When the baby and mother both died, he accused the midwife of causing his misfortune by casting spells upon them. Ina, who had spent 3 terrible days working to save the mother, could not hold her tongue. Exhausted and sorrowful, she called the man a monster and accused him of being the girl's father as well as her husband. Then she spit in his face. Enraged, the stranger reached for her throat and would have killed her had it not been for neighbors who were drawn by her screams and pulled him away. Ina showed us the black bruises on her throat. The man demanded restitution from Ina's father, but Ina had no father, nor had she brother or husband. She had lived alone after her mother's death. Having kept her family's hut, she did not want for shelter, and midwifery kept her in grain and oil and even wool for trade. Since she was burdened to no one, none had troubled about her, but now the angry stranger demanded to know why the townspeople tolerated such an abomination. "A woman in loan is in danger," he screamed into the faces of Ina's neighbors. "Where are your judges?" he hissed. "Who are your elders?" At that, Ina grew frightened. The most powerful man of her mud village had hated her since she had turned down a marriage offer on behalf of his half-wit son. She feared that he would incite the men against her and perhaps even enslave her. "Idiots, all of them," she said, and spat into the dust. "My thoughts turn to you for refuge," she said, addressing all the women of my family who walked nearby, listening to her every word. "Rachel knows I have always wanted to see more of the world than those dusty hills, and since Jacob treats his wives better than most, I came to see your departure as a gift from the gods," she continued. "And sisters, I must tell you, I am tired of eating my evening meals alone. I wish to see a baby I delivered as he grows into manhood. I wish to celebrate the new moon among friends. I want to know that my bones will be planted well after my death." Looking around at us, she smiled broadly. "So here I am." The women smiled back at her, happy to have such a healer among them. Although Rachel was skilled, Ina was famous for her golden hands and beloved for her stories. Zilpah saw Ina's appearance as a good omen. The midwife's presence lifted her spirits so much that later my aunt began to sing. It was nothing exalted, only children's song about a fly who bothered a rabbit who ate the insect but was eaten by a dog, who was in turn eaten by a jackal, who was hunted by a lion, who was killed by a boastful man, who was snatched by an Enlil, the sky gods, and placed in the heavens to teach him a lesson. It was a simple song known to every child and thus to every adult who had been a child. But the last verse, all of my mothers and the bondswomen and their children were singing. Even my brothers had joined in, with Simon and Levi making a contest of it, out-shouting each other. When the song ended, everyone clapped hands and laughed. It was sweet to be free of Laban's shadow. It was sweet to be at the beginning of a new life. That was the first time I heard women's voices and men's voices raised in song together, and throughout the journey, the boundaries between the men's lives and the women's relaxed. We joined the men in the work of watering the herd. They helped us unpack for the evening meal. We listened to them sing herding songs, addressed to the night sky, and filled with tales of constellations. They heard our spinning songs, which we sang as we walked and worked wool with small spindles. We applauded one another and laughed together. It was time out of life. It was like a dream. Most of the singing took place just before sleep or early in the morning, while we were still fresh. By afternoon, everyone was hungry and footsore. It took the women several days to get accustomed to wearing sandals from sunup to sunset. At home, we stayed barefoot in and around the tents. Ina relieved her blisters and soothed our aches by massaging our feet with oil perfumed with thyme. There was nothing wrong with our appetites, though. The long days left everyone ferociously hungry, and it was good that my brothers could supplement the simple bread and porridge of the road with birds and hares they hunted along the way. The meat tasted strange but wonderful the way Ina prepared it, with bright yellow spice she got in trade. There was little conversation during the evening meal. The men were in their circle and the women among themselves. By the time the moon rose, everyone was asleep. The women and the babies crowded inside one large tent, the men and boys on blankets under the stars. At dawn, after a hurried meal of cold bread, olives, and cheese, we began again. After a few days of this, I could barely remember my old life, rooted in one place. Every morning brought a new wonder. The first day, Ina joined us. The second day, late in the afternoon, we came upon a great river. My father had said we would cross the great water, but I had given no thoughts to the meaning of his words. When we came to the top of a hill overlooking the river valley, I was amazed. I had never seen so much water in one place, nor had any of us except Jacob and Ina. The river was not very wide where we forded it, or him, as Zilpah would have me say. Even so, it was 20 times wider than the stream I had known. He lay across the valley like a sparkling path, the setting sun catching fire on the way. We came to a crossing where the bottom was packed with pebbles and the ford was wide. The ground on either bank had been beaten smooth by many caravans, and my father decided we would stop here until morning. The animals were led to water, and we made camp. But before the meal, my father and my mothers gathered by the banks of the Euphrates and poured a libation of wine into the great river. We were not the only ones at the ford. Up and down the banks, traders had stopped to eat and sleep. My brothers wondered and stared at the new faces and strange clothes. "A camel," Joseph shouted, and our brothers chased after him to get a closer look at the spindly-legged beast. I could not go with them, but I did not regret being left behind. It gave me a chance to go down to the river, which drew me like a storyteller. I stood by the water's edge until the last trace of daylight had drained from the sky, and later, after the evening meal, I returned to savor the smell of the river, which was as heady to me as incense, heavy and dark and utterly different from the sweet, thin aroma of the well water. My mother, Leah, would have said I smelled the rotting grasses of the marsh and the mingled presence of so many animals and men, but I recognized the scent of this water the way I knew the perfume of my mother's body. I sat by the river even after the others went to sleep. I dangled my feet in the water until they were wrinkled and soft and whiter than I had ever seen them. In the moonlight, I had watched as leaves made their way slowly downstream and out of sight. I was lulled by the slow rush of the water against the shallow banks and was nearly asleep when voices roused me. Turning to look upstream, I saw two shapes moving about in the middle of the river. For a moment, I thought they might be river demons or water beasts come to drag me to a watery grave. I had no idea that people could move through the water like that. I had never seen swimming, but soon I realized they were merely men, the Egyptians who owned the camel, speaking to one another in a strange, purring language. Though their laughter was quiet, the water carried the sound as though they were whispering directly in my ears. I did not go to my blanket until they had left the water and returned the river to continue his peaceful journey through the night, undisturbed. In the morning, my father and my brothers walked into the river without even pausing, lifting their robes to keep dry. My mothers hung their sandals upon their girdles and giggled about showing so much of their legs. Zilpah hummed a river song as we crossed. The twins rushed ahead, splashing each other with thoughtlessly. But I was afraid. Even though I had fallen in love with the river, I could see that at its deepest point, the water lapped against my father's waist. That meant I would be submerged to my neck, and I would be swallowed. I thought about taking my mother's hand like a baby, but she was balancing a bundle on her head. All of my mother's hands were busy, and I was too proud to ask Joseph for his. I had no time to be afraid. The pack animals were at my back, forcing me ahead, so I entered the river and felt the water rise to my ankles and calves. The current felt like a caress on my knees and thighs. In an instant, my belly and chest were covered, and I giggled. There was nothing to fear. The water held no threat, only an embrace. I had no wish to break. I stood to one side of the ox passed, and then the rest of the animals. I moved my arms through the water, feeling them float on the surface, watching the waves and wake that followed my gesture. Here was magic, I thought. Here was something holy. I watched the sheep craning their necks high out of the water, the goats wide-eyed, barely touching the bottom with their hooves. And then came the dogs, who somehow possessed the trick of running through the water, pumping their legs and moving along, snorting but not suffering. Here was more magic. Our dogs could swim as well as Egyptians. Finally, Judah came up alongside me, looking as dubious as the water of the water as I had felt just a few moments earlier. "Sister," he said, "wake up and walk with me. Here is my hand," he offered. But as I reached out to take it, I lost my footing and fell backwards. Judah grabbed me and dragged. It was on my back, the sky above me, and I felt the water holding me up. Aye, a little shriek escaped from my mouth. A river demon, I thought. A river demon has hold of me. But Judah pulled me out onto the pebbles of the far bank, and I lost the wild lightness of my body. Later that night, when I lay down to sleep among the women, I told my mothers what I had seen and felt by the side of the river, and then in the water during my crossing. Silpa pronounced me bewitched by the river god. Leah reached out and squeezed my hand, reassuring us both. But Ina told me, "You are a child of water. Your spirit answered the spirit of the river. You must live by a river someday, Dina. Only by a river will you be happy." I loved every moment of the journey to Cana. As long as I kept my spindle busy, my mothers didn't mind what I did or where I went, so I wandered from the front of the caravan to the back, trying to be everywhere and see everything. I remember little of the land or the sky, which must have changed as we traveled. Once Rachel and Ina brought me with them to gather herbs and flowers up a hill that grew steeper and more rugged as we headed south. I was amazed to see trees growing so thickly that women as slender as Rachel and Ina had to walk in a single file to pass among them. I recall their curious needles that left my fingers smelling green all day. Best of all, I liked the sights of the road. There were caravans heading back to Egypt, loaded with cedar, lines of slaves headed for the Damascus, and traders from Shechem heading for Carchemish, near our old home. So many strange people passed by. Men who were clean-shaven as boys and huge, black, bare-chested men. Although there were fewer women on the road, I glimpsed mothers shrouded in black veils, naked slave girls, and a dancer who wore a breastplate made of copper coins. Joseph was as fascinated by the people as I, and he would sometimes run over to get a closer look at a particularly strange animal or costume. I was too shy to go with him, and my mothers would not have permitted it. My brother described what he saw, and we marveled over it. I did not share my observations of my own family with Joseph, though I felt like a thief, spying upon my parents and brothers, but I burned to know more about them, especially my father. Since Jacob walked with us for a little while every day, I watched him and noticed how he treated my mothers. He spoke to Leah about provisions and plans, and to Rachel about memories of his trip north to Haran. He was careful not to slight either woman in his attentions. Silpa bowed her head when my father approached, and he responded in kind, but they rarely spoke. Jacob smiled at Bela as though she were a little child. She was the only one he touched, running his hand over her soft black hair whenever he passed. It was an act of familiarity that seemed to express his fondness, but also proved her powerlessness as the least of his wives. Bela said nothing, but blushed deeply at these caresses. I noticed that Reuben's devotion to Bela had not faded over time. Most of my brothers, as they grew into their height and sprouted beards, loosened their childhood ties to my mothers and aunts, all except Reuben, who liked to linger near the women, especially Bela. During the trip, he seemed to know where she was at every moment. When he called for her, she replied, "Yes, brother," even though he was her nephew. She never spoke of him to anyone, and I don't think I ever heard her give voice to his name, but I could see their abiding affection, and it made me glad. Reuben was easy to know, but Judah was restless. He had chosen his position behind the herd, but sometimes he pressed one of his younger brothers to take his post so he could wander. I would climb to the top of a rocky hill and shout down to us, then disappear until nightfall. He's young for it, but that one's already hungry for a woman, Ina muttered to my mother one evening when Judah finally came to the fire later that night looking for his supper. I turned to Judah and realized that my brother's body had begun to take the shape of a man, his arms well muscled, his legs showing hair. He was the handsomest of all my brothers. His teeth were perfect, white, and small. I remember this because he smiled so rarely that they were always a surprise. Years later, when I saw pearls for the first time, I thought of Judah's teeth. Looking at Judah as a man, I had the thought that Reuben was certainly of an age to marry and father children. Indeed, he was not much younger than Nomir, whose daughter was almost ready to walk. Simon and Levi were old enough to have wives too. And then I understood another reason why we had left Haran, to get my brother's bride prices without Laban's sticky fingers getting in the way. When I asked my mother about this, she said, well, of course, but I was impressed with my own worldliness and insight. No one spoke of Laban anymore. As the days passed and the moon began to wane, it seemed we were free of my grandfather's grasp. Jacob had all but stopped visiting Judah at the rear of the herd, looking over his shoulder to see whether his father-in-law was coming. Instead, his thoughts turned towards Edom and his meeting with Eshua, the brother whom he had not seen for 20 years, since the day he had stolen his father's blessing and fled. The farther we walked from Haran, the more Jacob spoke of Eshua. On the day before the new moon, we stopped early in the afternoon to give us time to prepare the red tent and cook for the 3 days given to the women. Since we would stay in that place for more than one night, my father raised his tent as well. We were near a pretty little stream where wild garlic grew in profusion. The smell of bread soon filled the camp, and great pots of stew were prepared, so the men would have plenty to eat while my mothers retired for the service. My mothers and Uznus entered the women's tent before the sun set. I stayed outside to help serve the men. I never worked harder in my life. It was no small task feeding 14 men and boys and 2 young children, not to mention the women inside. Much of the serving fell to me, since Zibatu was often nursing her baby. Ina had no patience for my brothers. I was proud to be feeding my family, doing the work of grown women. When we finally joined my mothers in the tent after dark, I was never so grateful for rest. I slept well and dreamed of wearing a crown and pouring water. Zilpah said these were sure signs that my womanhood was not far off. It was a sweet dream, but it ended the next morning in a nightmare, haunted by Laban's voice. But it was no dream. My grandfather had arrived, demanding justice. "Give me the thief who took my idols," he bellowed. "Where are my teraphim?" I ran out of the tent just in time to see my father, the olive staff in his hand, stride up to meet Laban. Beor and Kemuel stood behind my grandfather, along with 3 bondsmen from Haran, who kept their eye on the ground rather than look into the face of Jacob, whom they loved. "Whom do you call a thief?" my father demanded. "Whom do you accuse, you old fool?" I served you for 20 years without pay, without honor. There was no thief in this place until you broke its peace. Laban was struck dumb by his son-in-law's tone. I am the reason for your comfortable old age, Jacob said. I have been an honest servant. I took nothing that was not mine. I have nothing here except that which you agreed was mine, and it was not fair payment for what I have given you. Your daughters are my wives and want none of you. Your grandsons are my sons and owe you nothing. While I stood on your land, I gave you honor you did not deserve, but now I am not bound by the obligations of guests and hosts. By then, all my brothers had gathered behind Jacob, and together they looked like an army. Even Joseph held a staff in his hands. The air was brittle with hatred. Laban took a step back. My son, why do you rebuke me? He wheedled, his voice suddenly old and soft. I am here only to say farewell to my beloved family, my daughters and my grandsons. We are kinsmen, you and I. You are my nephew, and I love you as a son. You misunderstood my words. I wish only to kiss my family and give you my blessing, he said, stretching his fingers wide, bowing his head like a dog showing submission. It was not the God of Abram, also the God of my fathers. He is great, to be sure. But my son, Laban said, looking up into Jacob's face, what of my other gods? What have you done with them? What do you mean, my father said. Laban narrowed his eyes and answered, my household gods have been stolen, and they disappeared upon your departure. I come to claim them for me and for my sons. Why do you wish to strip me of their protection? Do you fear their wrath, even though you worship the faceless one only? My father spat on Laban's feet. I took nothing. There is nothing in my household that belongs to you. There is no place for thieves under my tents. But Laban stood firm. My teraphim are precious to me. Nephew, I do not leave this place without them. At that, Jacob shrugged. They are not here, he said. See for yourself. And with that, he turned his back on Laban and walked away into the woods and out of sight. Laban began his search. My brothers stood, their arms crossed against their chest, and watched as the old man untied every bundle, unfurled every rolled-up tent, sifted his fingers through every sack of grain, squeezed every wineskin. When he moved toward Jacob's tent, Simon and Levi tried to block his way, but Reuben motioned them aside. They followed Laban and watched as he rummaged through our father's blankets and even lifted the floor mat to kick at the earth in case a hole had been dug. The day wore on and still Laban searched. I ran back and forth from where my grandfather hunted to the red tent, reporting what I saw to my mothers. Their faces stayed blank, but I knew they were worried. I had never seen women's hands working during the new moon, yet here every one of them was busy with their spindle. After Laban had ransacked my father's tent, there was nowhere left for him to search except the red tent, his eyes fixed upon the women's tent on the edge of the camp. It was unthinkable that a healthy man would walk of his own will inside a place during the head of the month. The men and boys stared to see if he would place himself among bleeding women, even worse, his own daughters. Laban muttered to himself as he approached the women's tent. At the door he stopped and looked over his shoulder. He glared at his sons and grandsons, and then Laban opened the flap and walked in. Laban's hoarse breath was the only sound. He glanced around the tent nervously, not meeting any of the women's eyes. No one moved or spoke. Finally, and with great contempt, he said, "Bah," and moved toward a pile of blankets. Rachel stood up from her place on the straw. She did not drop her eyes as she addressed her father. Indeed, she stared straight into his face, and without anger or fear or an apparent emotion, she said, "I took them, Father. I have all of your teraphim, all of your gods, they are here. I sit upon them. The teraphim of our family now bathe in my monthly blood, by which your household gods are polluted beyond redemption. You can have them if you wish," Rachel continued calmly, as though she were speaking of trifling things. "I will dig them out and even wipe them off for you if you like, Father. But their magic has been turned against you. You are without your protection from this time forward." No one drew breath as Rachel spoke. Laban's eyes widened and he began to tremble. He stared at his beautiful daughter, who seemed to glow in the rosy light that filtered through the tent. It was a long and terrible moment that ended when Laban turned and shuffled out of sight. Outside in the light, he found himself facing Jacob, who had returned. "You found nothing," my father said, with supreme confidence. When Laban made no reply, Jacob continued, "There are no thieves in my tents. This will be our last meeting, old man. We are finished." Laban said nothing, but opened his palms wide and bowed his head in acquiescence. "Come," he said, "we will settle our case." My grandfather motioned for Jacob to follow him up the hill to his camp. My brothers followed to give witness. Laban and Jacob each selected 10 stones and layered them one upon the other until they had created a cairn to mark the boundaries between them. Laban poured wine over it, Jacob poured oil upon it. Each man swore peace to the other, touching the other's thigh. Then Jacob turned and walked down the hill. It was the last time any of us saw Laban, which we counted as a blessing. Jacob was eager to be gone from the place, so the red tent was dismantled the next morning, and we continued our journey toward the land my father called home. My father was consumed with memories of Yeshua, though it had been 20 years. Jacob could still see his brother's face when Yeshua finally understood the full meaning of what had befallen him. Not only had Jacob betrayed him by stealing his beloved father's blessing, it was clear that Rebekah had been behind it, the last of many proofs of her preference for her younger son. Jacob had watched his brother's face as Yeshua pieced together the family treason, and my father was ashamed. Jacob understood the pain in Yeshua's belly and knew that it had been in the brother's place. He too would have given chase with a drawn dagger. Jacob dwelt upon a vision of this terrible avenging brother, describing him daily to his sons and to Leah, Rachel, and Bilhah during their nights with them. For now he raised his own tent so he could be comforted by a woman until morning. Jacob's fear was so great, it had erased all memory of his brother's love, which had always been stronger than the short-lived rages. He forgot the times Yeshua had fed him and protected him, laughed with him and praised him. My father's fear made Yeshua into a demon of revenge, whom I imagined red as a fox, with arms like tree trunks. This uncle haunted my dreams and turned the journey that I had loved into a forced march towards certain death. I was not the only one who walked in fear. There was no more singing on the road or in camp after my father began to tell his Yeshua stories. The journey was quiet in the days after we took final leave of Laban, and even Judah no longer wished to walk alone at the back of the herd. Soon there was another river to be crossed, and Yeshua had banished from my thoughts. I rejoiced to see flowing water again, and ran up to the river bank to put my face near the delicious smell and sound. My father, too, seemed refreshed by the sight of the river and by the task at hand. He declared we would make camp on the far side that night, and gathered his oldest sons around him to assign them their duties. although the water was nowhere near as wide as it had been. At the great river to the north, this river was deeper in the center and much faster. Leaves did not meander downstream but rushed away as though chasing after swift prey. Our crossing had to be quick as the sun was already beginning its descent. Ina and Zilpa poured an offering to the river god as the first of the animals were herded into the water and guided across. The smaller animals had to be taken 2 by 2 and by the scruff of their neck with a man on either side. The dogs worked until they were exhausted. We nearly lost one of them in the current, but Joseph grabbed him and became a momentary hero among his brothers. All of the men grew weary. Even Judah staggered from the effort of guiding frightened animals while withstanding a current that dragged at him. The river was generous and none of the animals was lost. By the time the sun was resting on the tops of the trees, only the ox, donkeys, women, and babies remained. Reuben and Judah struggled with their terrified ox, who bellowed like an animal headed for slaughter. It took a long while for them to drag the beast across, and by then it was dusk. My mother and I were the last to be taken across, my hand in hers this time so that I would not be stolen by the current. When we reached the far shore, it was dark and only my father was left behind. Jacob called across the river. "Reuben," he said, and my brother replied, "I am here." "See to the animals," my father said. "Don't bother with the tent. The night is warm enough. I will cross with the first light. Be ready to leave." My mother was not pleased with Jacob's plan and told Reuben to call back to our father and offered to cross the river and spend the night with him. He would not permit it. "Tell your mother to sit on her fears. I am neither a child nor a doddering elder. I will sleep by myself under the sky as I did in my youth when I traveled north. Be ready to leave in the morning," said Jacob, and smoked no more. The moon was still new, so the night was dark. The water would have sweetened the air, but not the wet coats of the animals muddied its perfume with musk. They bleated in their sleep, unused to being wet in the chill of the night. I tried to stay awake to listen to the music of the rushing water, but this time the splashing lulled me into a deep sleep. Everyone slept heavily. If my father cried out, no one heard him. Reuben was at the riverbank with Leah before sunrise to greet Jacob, but my father did not appear. The birds' greeting of the day had stilled and the sun had begun to draw the dew, but there was no sign of him. At Leah's signal, Reuben and Simon and Judah plunged into the water to seek their father. They found him beaten and naked in the middle of a brushy clearing, where the grass and the bushes had been crushed and broken in a wide circle around him. Reuben ran back to us shouting for a robe to cover our father, and then he carried him back across the stream. Uproar gave way to silence when Jacob was brought senseless, lying in his son's arms, his left leg hanging in an awkward angle, as though it were no longer attached to his body. Ina rushed forward and ordered my father's tent raised. Bela built a fire. The men stood by with empty hands. Reuben had no answers to their questions, and they fell silent. Ina walked out of the tent and said, "Fever." Rachel ran for her herb kit. Ina gestured for Reuben to follow her back inside, and a few moments later we heard the terrible animal scream as he guided our father's leg back into place. The whimpering that followed was even worse. Unnoticed and unneeded, I sat outside the tent, watching Ina's resolute face and Rachel's flushed cheeks as they walked in and out. I saw my mother's lips pressed into a thin line as she bent her head to hear their reports. I listened through the walls of the tent while my father screamed at a blue river demon and marshaled an army of angels to fight against a mighty enemy that rose from the waters. Silpa muttered incantations to Gula, and Ina sang of ancient gods whose names I had never heard: Nintinuga, Ninishsina, Baba. I heard my father weep and beg for mercy from his brother. I heard Jacob, the father of 11 sons, call out for his mother, Ima, Ima, like a lost child. I heard Ina hush him and encourage him to drink as though he were a swaddling baby. On that endless day, no one ate or worked. In the evening, I fell asleep in my place by the tent, my dreams shaped by my father's cries and my mother's murmurs. At dawn, I started awake and was greeted by the stillness. I jumped to my feet in terror, certain my father was dead. Surely we would be captured by Eshua and made into slaves. But as I began crying, Bila found me and held me. "No, little one," she said, stroking my matted hair. "He is well. He has recovered his sense, and he sleeps calmly now. Your mothers are sleeping too. They are so weary from their labors." By dusk of the second night after his ordeal, my father was well enough to sit by the door of his tent for the evening meal. His leg was still painful and he could barely walk, but his eyes were clear and his hands were steady. I slept without fear again. We stayed for 2 more months by the river Jabbok so that Jacob could heal. The women's tents were set up and the bondsmen's too. Days took on an orderliness, with the men tending the herds while the women cooked. We built an oven with clay from the river, and it was good to have fresh bread again, moist and warm, instead of the dried stuff we had eaten on the road, which always tasted of dust. During the first days of Jacob's illness, 2 sheep were slaughtered to make strengthening broths from their bones, so there was meat for a while. The rare treat made it seem like a festival. But as my father recovered his health, his fear returned even greater than before and changed him. Jacob could speak of nothing else but his brother's revenge, and he saw the nighttime attack and his struggle with the army of angels as portents of the battle to come. He grew suspicious of any attempt to calm him and sent gentle Reuben away. Instead, he came to depend upon Levi, who let Jacob number his worries endlessly and nodded grimly at our father's direst predictions. Among themselves, my mothers pondered the meaning of Jacob's last dream, so powerful that it had crossed over into this world. They debated Jacob's worries and plans. Should he attack? Was it a mistake to send a messenger to Ishua? Would it not have been wiser to appeal to his father Isaac for help? Perhaps the women should send a messenger to Rebekah, who was not only their mother-in-law, but their aunt as well. But they made no mention of the change in their husband's manner. The confident man had become tentative and cautious. The affectionate father had turned demanding and even cold. Perhaps they thought it was a symptom of his illness, or perhaps they simply did not see what I saw. I grew to hate every mention of Eshua, though after time my fear gave way toward him. My mothers did not even notice when I started avoiding their tents. They were too caught up in my father's unfolding story and speculations about what lay ahead, and there was little for me to do. All our wool was spun, and the looms would not be unpacked, so my hands were often idle. No one called for me to fetch water or carry wool, and there was no garden to weed. I was near the end of childhood, and I was freer than I had ever been or ever would be again. Joseph and I took to exploring the river. We walked its banks and watched the tiny fish that swarmed in its eddies. We hunted frogs, vivid green ones unlike we'd ever seen. I picked wild herbs and salads. Joseph trapped the grasshoppers to dip in honey. We bathed our feet in cool, swift waters and splashed each other until we were dripping. We dried ourselves in the sun, and our clothes smelled like the breeze and the water of the Jabbok. One day we walked upstream and discovered a natural bridge over the river, a path of flat stones that made for an easy crossing. With no one to forbid it, we crossed to the far side, and we soon realized that we had found the very place where our father had been wounded. We recognized the clearing he had described, the circle of 18 trees, the beaten down grass, and the broken and bent bushes. We found a scorched place on the ground where a great fire had burnt. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and Joseph took my hand in his, which was damp with fear. Looking up, we heard nothing but birdsong, no birdsong or whispering of leaves in the wind. The charred place gave no smell, and even the sunlight seemed muted around us. The air seemed as dead as Rudy lying in the wadi. I wanted to leave, but I could not move. Joseph told me later that he would have fled too, but his feet were rooted in the earth. We lifted our eyes to the sky, wondering if our father's fearful angels would return, but the heavens remained empty. We stood like stones, waiting for something to happen. A loud crash from the circle of trees broke like thunder, and we shrieked, or at least we tried to cry out, but no sounds issued from our open mouths as a black boar ran out of the forest. He ran straight for us across the battered meadow. We screamed our silent scream again, nor was there any noise from the hooves of the beast, which moved at us with the speed of a gazelle. I thought we were about to die, and my eyes filled with the pity of our mothers, and I heard Leah sobbing behind me. When I turned to find her, she was not there. Still, the spell had broken. My feet were free, and I ran back toward the river, pulling Joseph with a strength greater than my own. Perhaps there were angels on my side too, I thought as I reached the footstones and found my way over. Joseph slipped off the first rock and cut his foot. This time his voice rang out in pain. The sound of his cry seemed to stop the boar in its tracks, and the animal fell as though struck by a spear. Joseph recovered his footing and scrambled back to the far shore, where I held out my hand to him, and we embraced, trembling amid the sounds of the water, the rustling of leaves, and the terrified beating of our own hearts. What was that place? My brother asked, but I could only shake my head. We looked back to the boar and the clearing and the ring of trees, but the beast had vanished, and the scene now seemed ordinary, or even beautiful. A bird flew across the horizon, chirping, and the trees swayed with the wind. I shuddered, and Joseph squeezed my hand without a word. We swore the day to secrecy, but my brother was never the same. From that night forward, he began to dream with the power of our father's dreams. At first, he spoke of his wondrous encounters with the angels and demons, with dancing stars and talking beasts to me only. Soon his dreams were too big for my ears alone. Joseph and I returned to camp, afraid we would be questioned about our absence and worried about trying to keep what had happened from our keen-eyed mothers. But no one saw us come. All eyes were fixed upon a stranger who stood before Jacob. The man spoke in the clipped accents of the South, and the first words I heard from his mouth were, "My father." As I crept around to see the face of the messenger, I saw someone who could only be a kinsman. It was Eliphaz, Ishua's oldest son and my cousin, who looked so much like Judah that I clapped my hand over my mouth to keep from blurting it out loud. He was as ruddy and handsome as Judah, though taller, as tall as Reuben. In fact, he spoke with Reuben's gestures, his head tilted to one side, his left arm wrapped around his waist, his right hand clenching and unclenching as he brought us the news we had dreaded for so long. "My father arrives before dusk," said Eliphaz. "He comes with my brothers and with bondsmen and slaves, 40 in all, including the women. My mother is among them, he added, nodding towards my mothers, who smiled at the courtesy in spite of themselves. While Eliphaz spoke, my father's face was a mask, unchanging and impassive. In his heart, however, he railed and wept, shattered now were his careful plans for dividing our numbers, so Eshua could not destroy us in one attack. Useless all those evenings spent in directing my brothers as to which animals would be given as peace offerings, and which animals would be hidden from Eshua's grasp. My mothers had not even begun to separate and prepare the goods for my father. My father wanted to present to his older brother in hopes of appeasing his terrible anger. But now he was trapped, and he cursed himself for occupying his thoughts for too long with demons and angels and clouding his purpose. For now our tents were in an indefensible position, with the river blocking escape behind us. Jacob betrayed none of this to his nephew, however. He greeted Eliphaz with equal courtesy and thanked him for his message. He led him to his own tent, bade him rest, and called for food and drink. Leah went to prepare the meal. Rachel brought him barley beer, but the women did not rush so that Jacob could have time to think. While Eliphaz rested, Jacob found my mother and told her to get the women dressed in their finest robes and to prepare offerings. He had Reuben gather his brothers, also in their finest attire, but he directed that they they gird themselves with hidden daggers so that Eshua could not massacre them without some cost to himself. All of this was done swiftly, so that even Eliphaz rose from his meal. We were all arrayed and ready to leave. It is not necessary, uncle, Eliphaz said. My father comes to you. Why not receive him here in comfort? But Jacob said, no, I must greet my brother in a manner fit for a man of his station. We go out to give him welcome. Leaving only the bondsmen and their wives behind, Jacob led us. Eliphaz walked at his side, followed by the animals, offering 12 strong goats and 18 healthy sheep, shepherded by my brothers. I saw Leah look back over her shoulder, and sadness and fear across her face, like clouds across the sun, but she put away her sorrow quickly and remade her countenance into a picture of serenity. We walked for only a short time, not even long enough for our long robes to grow dusty, before my father put down his staff. Eshua was in sight on the far side of a gently sloping valley. Jacob walked out alone to greet his brother, and Eshua did the same. As their retinues of grown sun followed at little distance from the hillside, I watched in terror as the two men came face to face. In an instant, my father was on the ground before his brother. For one awful moment, I thought he had been felled by an unseen arrow or spear. But then he rose to his knees and bowed low, prostrating himself in the dust again and again, 7 times in all. It was the greeting of a slave to a master. My mother looked away in shame. Apparently, my uncle was also distressed by my brother's display, for he leaned down and took Jacob by the arm, shaking his head from side to side. I was too far away to hear words, but we could see the two men talking to each other, first crouching near the ground, then standing. And then the unthinkable happened. Eshua threw his arms around my father. My brothers immediately put their hands on their daggers, hidden in their girdles. But Eshua had moved not to harm his brother, but to kiss him. He gathered our father to his bosom in a long embrace, and when at last they let go of each other, Eshua pushed Jacob on the shoulder, a gesture of boys at play. Then he ran his hand through our father's hair, and at that both men laughed. the same hearty laugh that proved they had shared their mother's womb, even though one was dark and one was fair, one was slender and one was stocky. My father said something to his brother, and again Eshua held him to his chest. But this time, when they parted, there was no laughter. Reuben later said that their cheeks were wet with tears as they turned to walk back toward us. Their arms hung around each other's shoulders. I was amazed. Eshua was the red-faced, bloodthirsty avenger weeping in my father's arms. How could this man be the monster who haunted my dreams and chased the song from my brother's lips? My mother exchanged glances of disbelief, and Ina's shoulders shook with silent laughter. Your father was such a fool, she said. Weeks later in Sukkoth, as we retold the story of that day, to fear his baby-faced sweetling, to give us all nightmares over such a lamb as that. My father led Eshua back to where we stood, and Jacob presented gifts to his brother. Our uncle dutifully declined them 3 times, and then dutifully accepted his brother's offerings, praising each one in the most flattering terms. The ceremony of gifts took a long time, and I wanted only to get a closer look at the cousins who stood behind Eshua, especially at the women who wore necklaces and dozens of bracelets on their arms and ankles. After he had accepted the animals, the wool, the foodstuffs, and Jacob's second-best herding dog, Eshua turned to his brother and asked, in what sounded like my father's own voice, "Who are these fine men?" So Jacob presented his sons, who bowed low before their uncle, as they had been instructed. Here is Reuben, my firstborn, son of Leah, who stands there. My mother bowed her head very low, less to show respect, I think, than to keep Eshua from noticing her mismatched eyes before he had counted all of her sons. And here are more of Leah's children, Simon and Levi. This is Judah, my father said, clapping their 4th son on the shoulder. You can see how your image was never far from my mind. Judah and Eshua smiled at each other with the same smile. Zebulun is also Leah's son, and there are her twins, Naphtali and Issachar. Eshua bowed to my mother and said Leah is the mother of myriads, and Leah blushed with pride. Next, my father presented Joseph. This is the youngest, the only son of Rachel, he said, flaunting his fondness for my aunt. Eshua nodded and looked at the favorite son and stared at Rachel's undiminished beauty. She stared back at him, still thunderstruck by the events of the day. Next, Jacob called out the name of Dan. This is the son of Rachel's handmaid Bilhah, and here are Gad and Asher, born to me by Leah's girl, Zilpah. It was the first time I had heard the distinctions between my brothers or my aunties made so clear or public. I saw the sons of the lesser wives whom the world had called handmaids, and I saw how their heads dropped to be so named. But Eshua knew what it was to be second, and he approached the lesser sons just as he had my other brothers, going to Dan, Gad, and Asher, taking their hands in greetings. The sons of Bilhah and Zilpah stood taller, and I was proud to have such an uncle. Now it was my father's turn to ask about the sons of Eshua, who named them each with pride. You have met Eliphaz already, my firstborn by Edith, who stands there, he said, pointing to a small, plump woman who wore a head covering made of hammered copper disc. And here is Reuel, and Eshua putting his arm around a thin, dark man with a full beard. He is the son of Basemath, nodding at a sweet-faced woman who held a baby on her hip. My little boys are Jeush, Jalom, and Korah, and they stand with Basemath there. But they are the sons of Oholibamah, my youngest wife, Eshua said. She died last spring in childbirth. There was much craning of necks as introductions were made, but soon we were able to get a closer look at everyone as everyone began the short walk back to Jacob's Riverside camp. My older brothers eyed their grown cousins but did not speak. The women drew together and began the slow process of acquaintance. We found Eshua's daughters among them, including Adith's two youngest. Indeed, Adith had borne many girls, some of whom were grown and mothers themselves. But Libby and Amat were still with her. They were not much older than I, but they ignored me because I still wore a child's dress, and they were women. Basemouth was a kind stepmother to all of Olibama's children, and especially to the baby girl, E.T., who had cost Oholibama her life. Basemouth had lost so many babies, both boys and girls, she could barely number them. She had only the one son, Ruel, and one living daughter, Tabia, who was just my height. Tabia and I fell into step beside of each other, but kept quiet, not daring to disturb the solemn silence that fell upon the procession. It was late in the afternoon when we reached our tents, and a messenger had been sent to tell the bondswomen to begin the evening meal, and we were greeted by the smell of baking bread and cooking meat. Still, there was much to be done before we could have kind of a feast, called for by an occasion as great as the reconciliation of the sons of Isaac. The women fell to work, and Tabia was sent to help me collect wild onions along the river. We nodded our heads like dutiful daughters, but as soon as we faced away from our elders, I nearly laughed out loud. A wish had been granted. We could be alone. Tabia and I walked with great purpose toward the onion patch that I had picked bare the first day we had come to the Jabbok, and we found enough new shoots to fill her basket. But we decided that our mothers did not need to know how quickly we had finished, and we took advantage of our freedom, putting our feet in the water and pouring out the handful of stories that compose the memory of childhood. When I admired the copper bangles on her wrist, she told me her mother's life story, how Eshua had been smitten by the lovely young Basemouth when he saw her in the marketplace near Mamre, where our grandmother Rebecca lived. For a bride price, he had offered Basemouth's father, in addition to the usual number of sheep and goats, no fewer than 40 copper bangles, so that her wrists and ankles should announce her beauty. He said Eshua loved Basemouth, but she suffered at the hands of his first wife, Edith, who was jealous. Not even the stillbirths of Basemouth's babies had softened Edith's heart. When I asked how they could celebrate the new moon together with so much anger in the house, Tabia said the women of her family did not mark the moon's death and rebirth together. That's another thing that grandmother hates about the wives of Eshua, Tabia said. You know our grandmother? I asked. You know Rebecca? Yes, said my cousin. I saw her twice at the barley harvest. The grandmother smiles at me, though she does not speak to my mother, nor Edith, nor did she take notice of Oholibama when she was alive. The grandmother says hateful things about my mother, and that is wrong. My cousin knit her brow, and her eyes filled with tears. But I love the grandmother's tent. It is so beautiful there, and even though she is the oldest woman I ever saw, her beauty is not erased. Tabia giggled and said, the grandmother tells me that I look like her, even though it is clear that I resemble my mother in every way. Tabia did seem a copy of Basemouth, with her thin nose and glossy dark hair, her fragile wrists and ankles, but when I met Rebecca, I remembered my cousin's words and saw that the grandmother meant it was Tabia's eyes that Rebecca could claim as her own, for my cousin's eyes were black and direct as arrows, where batesments were brown and always downcast. I told Tavia about the red tent and how my mother celebrated the new moon with cakes and songs and stories, leaving ill will outside for the duration of the darkness, and how I, the only daughter, had been permitted inside with them throughout my childhood, although it was against custom for anyone past weaning and not yet a woman to enter. At this, we both looked down upon our chest and pulled our tunics tight to compare what was happening to our bodies. Although neither of us was ready to suckle, it seemed that I would reach womanhood first. Tavia sighed and I shrugged. Then we laughed until our eyes filled with tears, which made us laugh even more until we were rolling on the ground. When we caught our breath, we spoke of our brothers. Tavia said she did not know Eliphaz well, but that Ruel was kind. Of the little boys, she had hated Jeush, who pulled her hair at every turn and kicked her shins whenever he was sent to help her in the garden. I told her how Simon and Levi made Joseph and my other brothers abandon our games and how they treated me like their personal servant, whose only duty is to keep their wine cups filled. I even told her how I spit into their cups when I had the chance. I spoke of Reuben's kindness and Judah's beauty, and how Joseph and I had been nursed together. I was shocked when Tavia said she wanted no children. I have seen my mother cradle too many dead babes, she said, and I heard a holy mama scream for the 3 days before she gave her life for E.T. I am not willing to suffer like that, Tavia said. She wanted no part of marriage, but would rather serve as Mamre or change her name to Deborah. Or else, she said, she would sing at the altar of the great temple like the one in Shechem. There I would become one of the consecrated women who weave for the gods and wear clean robes always. And then I will sleep alone unless I choose to take consort at the barley festival. I did not understand her desires. Indeed, I did not fully understand her words, since I knew nothing about temples or the women who served there. For my part, I told Tavia I hoped for 10 strong children like those of my mother had borne, though I wanted 5 girls at least. It was the first time I had said these things aloud, and perhaps the first time I had even given them thought, but I spoke from my heart. I would have no fear of childbirth. You have no fear of childbirth, asked my cousin. What of the pain? What if the baby dies? I shook my head. Midwives do not fear life, I said, and I realized that I had come to think of myself as Rachel's apprentice and Ina's granddaughter. Tavia and I stared into the water as our words ebbed. We pondered the differences between us and wondered if our hopes would be fulfilled and whether we would ever learn what happened to the other after our fathers took their leave. My thoughts flew back and forth like the shuttle on a great loom, so that when I finally heard my name in my mother's mouth, there was some anger in it. We had tarried too long. Tavia and I walked quickly hand in hand back to the cooking fires. My cousin and I did our best to stay together after that, watching our mothers circle one another with thinly veiled curiosity. They studied one another's clothes and recipes, politely asking one another to repeat their names just one more time, if you please, to get the pronunciation right. I could see my mother's eyebrows rise as the Canaanite women's use of salt, and I noticed Edith stiffen at the sight of Bilah's adding a handful of fresh onions to her dried goat stew. But all judgments were masked under thin smiles amid the rush to prepare the feast. While the women readied the meal, Eshua and Jacob disappeared within my father's tent. After the sons of Eshua put up their tents for the night, they gathered near my father's door, where my brothers also stood. Reuben and Eliphaz exchanged pleasantries about their father's flocks, subtly comparing the number and health of each herd, sizing up each other's approach to the pasturage and skills with dogs. Eliphaz seemed surprised that neither Reuben nor any of his brothers had yet married and sired children, but this was not a subject that Reuben would discuss with the son of Eshua. There were long lulls in the conversation between the cousins who kicked at the dirt and clenched and unclenched their fists in boredom. Finally, the flap to the tent opened, and my father and Eshua walked out, rubbing their eyes at the lingering brightness of the day, calling for wine for the meal to begin. The two brothers sat on a blanket that Jacob spread himself. Their sons arranged themselves in self-conscious order of rank, Eliphaz and Reuben standing behind their fathers, Joseph and Korah sitting at their sides. As I ran back and forth, keeping the wine cups filled, I noticed how my brothers outnumbered Tabia's, and that they were much more handsome than the sons of Eshua. Tabia served bread, while our mothers and their servants filled the men's plates until they could eat no more. Every woman noticed who had taken the most of her stew, her bread, her beer, and each man took pains to compliment the food served by his brothers' wives. Eshua drank deeply of my mother's beer and favored Bilhah's oniony goat dish. Jacob ate little, but did his best to honor the food brought to him by Basemath and Edith. When the men were done, the women and the girls sat, but as happens with great meals, there was little appetite after the hours of stirring and tasting. The mothers were served by the slaves of Eshua, two strong girls wearing small silver rings through holes in their upper ears. One of them was pregnant. Tabia whispered that it was Eshua's seed, and if she bore a son, the girl would remove the upper earring and become a lesser wife. I stared at the strapping slave girl, her ankles as thick as Judah's, and then glanced at the slender Basemath and told Tabia that Eshua's taste in wives was as generous as his other appetites. She started to giggle, but a glare from Edith stifled us. The light was starting to fade when Jacob and Eshua began to tell stories. Our bondswomen brought lamps, and Eshua's slaves kept them filled with oil, so the light from the flames danced upon the faces of the family, suddenly grown numerous. Tabia and I sat knee to knee listening to the story of our great-grandfather Abram, who had left the ancient home of Ur, where the moon was worshipped in the name of Nana and Ningal, and gone to the Haran, where the voice of El had come to him and directed him to Cana. In the south, Abram had done great deeds, killing 1,000 men with a single blow, because El Abram had given him the power of 10,000. Jacob spoke of the beauty of Shari, Abram's wife, and a servant of Inanna, the daughter of Nana and Ningal. Inanna loved Sarai so well that the goddess came to her in the terebinth grove at the Mari and gave her a healthy son in the extremity of her life. The son was our grandfather Isaac, the husband of Rebekah, who was the niece of Sarai, the priestess. It was Rebekah, my grandmother, who divined for the people now as Sarai Holy Grove in Mamre. Having recalled the family history in the proper fashion, my father and my uncle moved on to the childhood stories, slapping each other on the back as they recalled the times they had slipped away from their mother's garden to play with the baby lambs, helping one another remember the names of their favorite dogs, the black, the dappled, and especially the three-legged wonder, a miraculous bitch that survived a jackal attack and still herded with the best. It was wonderful to see my father's face, all these stories spilled out. I could see him as a boy again, carefree, strong, and willful. His reserve melted as Eshua reminded him of the day they had fallen into the wadi and entered their mother's tent covered in thick gray mud. He laughed at the story about a time the brothers stole a whole day's worth of baking, ate themselves sick, and suffered a beating for it. After many stories, a satisfied hush fell over the company. We listened to the rustling of the herds and the Jabak's whispers and then Eshua began a song. My father broke into a wide grin and joined in, giving loud and lusty voice to the words of an unfamiliar herding song, all about the power of certain ram. The women pinched their lips together as the verses continued, each one randier and bolder than the last. To my amazement, my brothers and our cousins knew every word and joined in, making a great shout of their voices and finishing with a whoop and then laughter. When the men were finished, Eshua nodded to his first wife, who gave a sign that opened the mouths of his wives and daughters, his bondswomen and slaves girls. It was a hymn to Anat, a name the Canaanite women used for Anana, as it praised the goddess's prowess in war and her power in love. Their songs were unlike anything I've heard, and their hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and though Joseph was tickling me with the stalk of grass, but when I turned to rebuke him, I saw that he sat by my father's side, his eyes shining and fixed upon the singers. They sang the words in unison, yet somehow created a web of sound with their voices. It was like hearing a piece of fabric woven with all the colors of the rainbow. I did not know that such beauty could be formed by the human mouth. I had never heard harmony before. When they finished, I discovered tears in my eyes and saw that Zilpah's cheeks were wet too. Bilah's lips were parted in admiration, and Rachel's eyes were closed to listen with perfect attention. The men applauded and asked for more, so Basemath began anew with a song about the harvest and the fullness of the earth. Tabia joined in with them, and I was dazzled to think that my friend could perform such a miracle with her mothers. I closed my eyes. The women sang like birds, only more sweetly. They sounded like the wind in the trees, but louder. Their voices were like the rush of the river's water, but with meaning. Then their words ceased, and they began to sing with sound that meant nothing at all, yet gave a new voice to joy, to pleasure, to longing, to peace. Lu, 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 they sang. When they finished, Reuben applauded the music of his kinswomen and bowed low to them. Joseph and Judah and Dan also rose and bowed in thanks, and I thought, these four are my favorites and the best of my brothers. There were more songs and a few more stories, and we sat by the light of the lamps. Only when the moon began to set did the women clear the last of the cups. With sleeping children in their arms, the young mothers moved toward their own beds, and the men began taking their leave too. Finally, only Jacob and Eshua sat staring silently at the sputtering wick of the last lamp. Tabia and I slipped away and walked down to the river, our arms around each other's waist. I was perfectly happy. I could have stood there until dawn, but my mother came to find me, and though she smiled at Tabia, she took my hand and pulled me away from my friend. I woke the next morning to the sounds of Eshua's tribe making ready to leave. During their late-night conversations, my father told his brother that he would not follow them back to Seir. As fondly as the brothers had met, their fortunes could not be married. My uncle's lands were vast and his position secure. Had we joined him, Jacob's worth would be judged puny in comparison. My brothers, too, would have been at a disadvantage, even since Eshua's sons already had flocks and lands of their own. And for all the fellowship of the night before, the sons of Isaac were not entirely reconciled, nor could they ever be. The scars they had borne for 20 years could not be erased with a single meeting, and the habits of those years, lived in such different worlds, were bound to come between them. Nevertheless, the brothers embraced with declaration of love and promises to visit. Reuben and Eliphaz clasped each other by the shoulders. The women nodded goodbye. Tabia showed her boldness by running from her mother's side to hug me, and we tasted each other's tears. While we held each other, she whispered, "Take heart, we will be together again soon at the grandmother's tent. I heard my mother say we would surely meet you there at the barley festival. Remember everything that happens from now until then so you can tell me." With that, she kissed me and ran back to her mother's side. She waved her hand until she was out of my sight. As soon as they departed, my father instructed Reuben and my mother to prepare for our own leave-taking. I did my part with a happy heart, glad to take up our travels free of the fear of Yeshua, eager to see my friend again and to meet the grandmother who had already begun to live in the imagination. I was certain that Rebecca would love my mothers. After all, they were her nieces as well as her daughter-in-law. And I imagined myself her pet, her favorite. Why shouldn't I be, I thought. After all, I was the female heir of her favored son. The next morning we departed, but we did not travel far. On the second day, my father plunged his staff into the earth near a small stream beneath a young oak tree and announced his intention to stay. We were near the village called Sokoth, he said, a place that had been kind to him on his journey north. My brothers had scouted the land before and secured a site for us, and within a few days there were pens and stalls for the animals, and a fine clay oven large enough to bake both bread and cakes. We dwelt there for 2 years. The journey from the house of Laban had given me a taste for change, and the daily routines of settled life in Sokoth bored me at first. But my days were filled with sunrise to dusk, and soon I learned to enjoy the alchemy of turning flour into bread, meat into stew, water into beer. I also moved from spinning to weaving, which was far more difficult than I had ever imagined, and a skill I never mastered like Zilpah and Bela, for whom the warp never broke. As the oldest girl, I was often given charge of the bondswomen's children, and learned both to love and resent the runny-nosed monsters. I was needed so much within the world of women that I barely noticed how little I had to do with my brothers or how things changed among them. For those were the days when Levi and Simon replaced Reuben at their father's right hand and became his closest advisors. Succoth was a fertile place for my family. Zebatu had a new baby, and so did Uzna, both of them sons whom my father took to his altar under the oak tree. He circumcised them and declared them free of their father's indenture, full members of the tribe of El-Habram, and the tribe of Jacob's crew. Bela conceived in Succoth, but she miscarried before the baby moved in her womb. Rachel was bereaved in the manner as well, and for nearly a month after would not let Joseph out of her sight. My mother, too, lost a child who came from the womb months too soon. The women looked away from the tiny doomed girl, but I saw only her perfect beauty. Her eyelids were veined like a butterfly's wings, and her toes curled like the petal of a flower. I held my sister, who was never given a name and who never opened her eyes, and who died in my arms. I was not afraid to hold that small death. Her face was peaceful and her hands perfectly clean. It seemed she would wake at any moment. The tears from my eyes fell upon her alabaster cheeks, and it appeared that she mourned the passing of her own life. My mother came to take my sister from me, but seeing my sorrow permitted me to carry her to burial. She was shrouded in a scrap of fine cloth and laid beneath the strongest, oldest tree within sight of my mother's tent. No offerings were made, but as the bundle was covered with earth, the sighs that poured from my mother's mouth were as eloquent as any psalms. As we walked away from the baby's death, Zilpah muttered that the gods of the place were arrayed against life, but as usual my auntie misread the signs, for the bondswomen grew great with child as quickly as their babies were weaned. every ewe and goat bore twins, and all of them survived. The flocks grew quickly and made my father a prosperous man, which meant my brothers could wed. 3 of them married in Sukkoth. Judah married Shua, the daughter of a trader. She conceived during their nuptial week and bore him Er, the first of his sons and the first of my father's grandsons. I liked Shua, who was a plump and good-natured. She brought the Canaanite gift of song into our tents and taught us harmonies. Simon and Levi took 2 sisters to wife, Ialutu and Inbu, the daughters of a potter. It fell to me to stay with the babies and mind the fires while the wives of Jacob attended the festivities. I was furious about being left behind, but in the weeks after the nuptials, I heard my mother's talk over every detail of the wedding so much that I felt I had been there myself. Surely you must admit the singing was wonderful, said Zilpah, who returned from each one humming a new melody, slapping the rhythm with her hand against a bony thigh. Well, of course, said my mother in an offhand way. They learned this from their mothers and their grandmothers. Rachel grinned and leaned over to Leah. Too bad our grandmothers could not cook, eh? Leah smirked in agreement. When it was Dina's turn to enter the bridal tent, I will show them how a wedding feast should be arrayed, she said, running her hand over my head. Only Bila seemed to enjoy her nephew's weddings. Oh, sister, she said to Leah, didn't you think the veil was pretty? Short, shot through with golden threads and hung with the dowry coins, I thought was arrayed like a goddess. Leah would have none of it. Are you going to tell me that your belly was full after the meal? She said. But Leah was not unhappy with the brides her sons brought her. They were all healthy and respectful, though Shua quickly became the favorite. The 2 sisters never fully entered my mother's circle, and they lived with their husbands at a short distance from the rest of us. Closer to the herds, my brothers said. I think Simon and Levi moved because Ialutu and Inubu wanted to keep their distance. I did not miss their company at all. They treated me with the same disdain as their husbands, and besides, my mother was right, neither of them could cook. Of Jacob's older sons, only Reuben remained unmarried. My eldest brother seemed content to serve his mother and do kindness to Bila, whose only son was still too young to hunt. Early one morning, while everyone slept, a woman's voice called, "Where are the daughters of Sarai? Where are the wives of Jacob?" It was a soft voice, and yet woke me from a deep sleep where I lay at my mother's feet. Like me, Leah sat up at the sound and hurried outside, arriving at the same moment as Rachel. Within a heartbeat, Bila and Zilpah were there as well, the 5 of us staring at the messenger from memory, whose dress shimmered silver in the blue glow of the heralds of dawn. Her speech was formal, in the manner of a messenger. Rebekah, the oracle of Mamre, the mother of Jacob and Eshua, the grandmother of hundreds of myriads, calls you to the canopy of terebinths for the barley festival. Let Jacob be told and know. Silence greeted the declaration of this visitor, who spoke in strange accents that pent every word in 3 places. It was as though we were all sharing a dream, for none of us had ever seen red hair before, nor had we ever seen a woman carry the messenger's striped bag. And yet it was no dream, as the morning chill made us shiver. Finally, Leah caught her breath and gave welcome, offering the stranger a place to sit and bread to eat. But as soon as we were assembled around our guest, my aunties and I again fell still and stared in plain amazement. The messenger looked around her and broke into a smile that showed a row of small yellow teeth between a pair of oddly dappled lips. Speaking now in ordinary voice and with lightness that set everyone at ease, she said, I see you number few redheads among you. Where I come from, it is said that red-headed women are begotten during their mothers' periods, such as the ignorance of the lands of the north. Bila laughed out loud to hear such boldness from a stranger. This seemed to please our guest, who turned to my aunt and presented herself. My name is Werenro, and I serve the grandmother. At that she pulled her hair back to show her ear, pierced high with the plain bronze stud, and added, I am the world's happiest slave. Again Bila laughed aloud at such plain-spokenness. I giggled too. As soon as the men were fed, Leah sent for Jacob and presented the messenger, who by then had covered the fire of her hair and lowered her eyes. She comes from your mother, Leah said. Rebecca bids us to attend the barley festival. The messenger awaits your reply. Jacob seemed startled by the newcomer's presence, but composed himself quickly and told Leah that they would obey Rebecca in everything, and that he would come to her at harvest time, and he and his wives with his sons and his daughters. Werenro then withdrew to my mother's tent and slept. I worked nearby all day, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. I tried to think of some reason to enter the tent. I wanted to see her hair again, and my fingers longed to touch the robes that moved like weeds in flowing water. Ina told me Werenro's clothes were made of silk, a kind of cloth that was woven by worms on their own tiny looms. I raised my eyebrow, doing my best to copy my mother's most disdainful gestures, to show that I was too old to be taken in by such nonsense. Ina laughed at me and wasted no further breath on my disbelief. Werenro rested undisturbed late into the evening, until after the men had eaten and the bowls of the women's evening meal were cleared. My mothers had gathered by their fire, hoping the stranger would appear in time to give us a story. The messenger walked out of the tent, and seeing us arrayed around her, she bowed deeply, with her fingers stretched wide in an unfamiliar gesture of obeisance. Then she straightened her back, looked into our faces one by one, and grinned like a little child who stole a fig. Werenro was unlike anyone or anything else in the world. I was enchanted. She bowed her head at my mother's in thanks for the bowl of olives, cheese, and fresh bread that had been left for her. Before eating, she recited a short prayer in a language that sounded like a buzzard's cry. I laughed at the noise, thinking she was making another joke, but the red-headed stranger shot me a look of withering anger. I felt as though my face had been slapped, and my cheeks grew hot and as crimson as her hair, which was once again visible and improbably red, as I remembered. But in the next moment she smiled forgiveness at me, and patting the ground by her side, welcomed me to place of honor. After she put aside the last of her meal with compliments for the bread and extravagant praise for the beer, Werenro began a chant. There were many strange names in her story, and the melody that was sadder than anything I'd ever heard. She held us all wrapped like a baby on a lap. It was the story of the beginning of the world, of a tree and a hawk who gave birth to a red wolf, who populated the world with a womb that gave birth to all red-blooded life, save women and men. It was a very long story, mysterious and filled with names of unfamiliar trees and animals. It was set in a place of terrible cold, where the wind screamed in pain. It was frightening and thrilling and lonely. When Werenro stopped, the fire was out and only one lamp sputtered a dim light. The little ones were asleep in their mothers' laps, and even a few of the women dozed, their heads dropping on their chests. I looked into the face of the messenger, but she did not see me. Her eyes were closed above smiling lips. She was far away in the land of her story, a cold land of strange myths where her own mother was buried. I felt the messenger's loneliness, so far from home. I understand Warren-Ro's heart the way I understood the sun when it warmed my face. I reached out my hand and placed it on her shoulder, and Warren-Ro turned to me, open eyes glistening with tears, and kissed me on the lips. "Thank you," she said, and stood. She walked into my mother's tent and left before dawn, without telling me how the red wolf in the story gave rise to man and woman. But this did not worry me, for I knew that I would hear the rest of it in Momray when we went to see the grandmother at last. Thank you all for joining me tonight. I will be doing a second video probably here in just a little while, so I will be uploading two tonight or tomorrow. Again, I want to try to finish this book as quickly as I can, so I appreciate your patience while we get through it. Also, don't forget to subscribe and like. Please leave a comment. And thank you. Happy sleeping.